Hey guys, it's Fancy, and you're watching the Good Wives Network. And recently, Gypsy Rose posted publicly that we need to be having more conversations about coercive control and trauma. So let's dish. But if we are going to have that conversation, we have to do it accurately because coercive control is not a catch all phrase. Trauma is not a narrative device, and psychology is not interchangeable with sympathy. This video is not about denying trauma. It's about explaining what trauma actually looks like, what coercive control actually means, and why the behaviors Gypsy displays do not align with either. Before we begin, a brief note. This discussion is for educational and analytical purposes only. We are not diagnosing any individual. We are discussing established psychological frameworks, peer-reviewed research, and publicly documented behavior patterns. This video also includes discussions of harmful ideation involving children in a non-graphic, analytical manner for the purpose of education and public safety. So, what is coercive control actually? The term coercive control was developed by sociologist Evan Stark, and it has a very specific meaning. In his book from 2007, Coercive Control, Stark describes it's not an isolated abuse, but as what he calls a liberty crime, a pattern of domination that strips away a person's autonomy, agency, and the capacity for independent action over time. He emphasizes that coercive control works quietly. It isolates, it restricts, it erodes decision making. But most importantly, Stark makes clear that power moves in one direction. Victims of coercive control do not gain influence, they lose it. They become smaller, not more strategic, quieter, not more directive, more fearful, not more confident. That point is foundational. So, how trauma manifests in true coercive control victims. To know this, we look at psychiatrist Judith Herman in her foundational work, Trauma and Recovery from 1992. This explains that prolonged interpersonal trauma, especially captivity like dynamics, produce predictable psychological responses. She writes that survivors often experience what she calls a constriction of consciousness, along with hypervigilance, shame, guilt, and diminished initiative. Translated into plain language, people hesitate, they fear consequences, they struggle to act independently. Similarly, Dutton and Goodman, in their research on coercion and abusive relationships, describes victims as showing compliance behavior, not dominance behaviors. And this is critical. Victims of coercive control do not typically plan multi-step outcomes, recruit others to act on their behalf, maintain parallel identities across audiences, control narratives before and after events. Those behaviors require agency, perceive safety, and confidence, the opposite of what coercive control produces. Medically fragile children and trauma, what science actually shows. Now, let's be precise. Medically fragile children can experience trauma. This is real, documented, and highly serious. Pediatric psychologist Anne Kazak and her colleagues have shown that children with chronic or severe medical conditions may develop anxiety, medical PTSD, and avoidance behaviors related to healthcare environments. Later reviews, including Price et al., confirmed that repeated hospitalizations and invasive procedures can be psychologically distressing. But here is the key distinction that often gets erased. Medical trauma is fear-based, not goal oriented. It produces anxiety, avoidance, hypervigilance, and control seeking around one's own body. It does not produce instrumental violence, long term predatory manipulation, lack of remorse, the exploitation of others for personal gain. It does not express any of those. Medical trauma creates vulnerability, not psychopathy. Personality structures. What trauma does not create? This brings us to cluster B personality structures, particularly antisocial personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder. According to the DSM-5 TR, these are enduring patterns that appear by adolescence or early adulthood, remain consistent across situations, are not limited to one relationship or context, and are not explained by trauma alone. Psychopathy researcher Robert Hare in Without Conscious states plainly, trauma does not create psychopathy. At most, it shapes how existing traits are expressed. In other words, trauma may coexist, but it does not manufacture persistent patterns of deceit, manipulation, entitlement, and instrumental aggression. Those patterns require developmental reinforcement, not just suffering. The researcher Robert Hare in Without a Conscience states plainly, trauma does not create psychopathy. At most, it shapes how existing traits are expressed. In other words, trauma may coexist, but it does not manufacture persistent patterns of deceit, manipulation, entitlement, and instrumental aggression. Those patterns require developmental reinforcement, not just suffering. So, what Gypsy's behavior actually demonstrates? So, when we apply these frameworks carefully, what we see is not the psychology of someone stripped of agency. Instead, we see patterns that indicate control, not compliance, and these include strategic narrative shifts depending on audience, infantilization when it provides benefit, sexualized vulnerability paired with dominance, recruiting a cognitively vulnerable individual to commit murder, directing violence while maintaining distance, post event narrative management, and persistent lack of accountability paired with entitlement. Psychological literature refers to this as instrumental behavior, actions taken deliberately to achieve a desired outcome. As Cooper and colleagues note in their research on instrumental aggression, this type of behavior is planned, purposeful, and detached from immediate threat. That is not trauma behavior. Sexualized control, ideation, and why this is not trauma or role play. There is one area that must be addressed directly because avoiding it creates more harm than addressing it carefully. In recorded video communications between Gypsy and Nick, Gypsy discusses an alternate family structure involving rigid power hierarchies, enforced secrecy, and sexualized authority over hypothetical children. Gypsy has consistently claimed that these ideas originated with Nick. However, there is no independent evidence showing that Nick introduced or initiated these concepts. What the material shows instead is Gypsy leading the discussion, explaining how the structure would work, why secrecy would be necessary, and why children would need to be trained not to disclose the family's dynamics out of fear of legal consequences. That distinction matters. From a trauma psychology standpoint, sexualized behavior arising from trauma is typically disorganized, reactive, and rooted in boundary confusion or fear. Judith Herman describes trauma reenactment as compulsive, not ideological, not instructional, and not future oriented. What is being described here is structured. It involves rules, rows, secrecy protocols, and justification for silence. That moves it out of trauma reenactment and into the realm of organized belief systems. This is also not consensual role play. Role play requires adult participants, multiple boundaries, mutual boundaries, and the absence of real world harm. The moment imagined, our future children are placed into a sexualized hierarchy, especially with the emphasis on silence and fear of legal consequences, it stops being a fantasy. In forensic psychology, this type of thinking is described as anticipatory grooming cognition, the normalization of future abuse scenarios under the framing of lifestyle or inevitability. It's not hypothetical play, it is ideation. Ideas like this do not exist in isolation, and they do not simply disappear. Research on coercive sexual cognition shows that these belief structures are stable over time, especially when reinforced by validation, sympathy, or, you guessed it, lack of accountability. This matters particularly now because there is a real child involved, allegedly. Protective systems exist because patterns repeat. Role reversal, follow the power. In trauma analysis, one question clarifies everything. Who had the power? Who planned? Who directed? Who framed morality? Who became the benefactor of the outcome? Who controlled the story afterwards? Victims of coercive control do not author outcomes, they endure them. Power leaves fingerprints, and those fingerprints do not belong to a silenced child. Trauma is real. Medical trauma is real. But trauma is not a blank check. It does not excuse manipulation, deception, exploitation, or instrumental violence. Misusing trauma language harms real survivors, the ones who truly lost agency, voice, and power. This isn't about cruelty, it's about precision. If we are going to talk about coercive control, we need to be honest about who was exercising it, because not everyone who claims trauma is a victim. Some are authors. Have a good one from the Good Wife, serving up true crime, one dish at a time. Bye, guys. Mwah.